this one's going to be exciting. So I am going to get out of here and let you guys do your thing, and I'll be back for the Q&A segment at the end of the show thing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark.
Awesome. Have fun. Bye, guys.
Thank you, Mark.
Hey, everybody. Welcome, and welcome, Simon. How are you?
I'm very, very well indeed. It's great to see you again, Andrew.
Excellent. Yeah, you too. You too. I was going back through our shared personal history, which has crisscrossed many times, and we've known each other for more than 30 years now, which is slightly spooky. But so I would give you an introduction, but I think we'll just let this entire interview be an introduction, right? There's no point in recapping something we're about to delve into. So just for the briefest of overviews, you have been involved in record making, film scoring, theme park sound, classical composing, and I'm going to get into that a bit more to find out exactly your involvement in the performances of these pieces that have been staged, because that's gigantic. So basically almost, and jingle writing as well. So almost every aspect of where music can fit into people's lives, you have done music for that. Oh, and also just a little installation at a very small museum no one's ever heard of, which we'll talk about, for a band that no one's really that interested in. But it's going to take about 45 minutes to get to that, I think. So by way of starting off, what I would love to do is, you started off in a more traditional position for the people who go to Puremix and things like that. You worked at SARM Studios, which was Trevor Horn's studio. Every studio he owned was called SARM in one way or another, which I looked it up, and it stands for Sound and Recording Mobiles.
Yes.
It's not a very good acronym, is it?
This was Jill Sinclair's studio, who was Trevor's wife. And I'm sorry, for 1 second, let me just try something. We've got a massive howl round.
Oh, no.
Let me just try and see if I can fix this. There we go. Hopefully you can hear me again. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's better. Fixed it. For some reason, there were job things.
It's audio. We're no good at audio here.
So I joined SARM basically because I had been in a tiny, tiny studio that owned a thing called a PPG Wave and Wave Term, which was one of the very, very first things. I always knew I was going to do this. I'm unemployable in any other regard. And the PPG Wave and Wave Term had this wonderful advantage of breaking down all the time. And it meant that I had to take it back to the distributors. Distributors also happened to distribute the Synclavier, of which you and I, of course, are. That's where we met.
Yeah.
They told Trevor to hire me. And so I got hired because the PPG broke down all the time. And I joined, I got hired at end of December, and I had to start work January the 6th.
And this
I'd
is
never
what year?
seen it. 1986, I want to say.
Right.
And I'd never seen a Synclavier before, so I took the manuals home.
Which, just so you know, the manuals are like that, basically. It's phone books worth of manuals.
It was. I read all the manuals, and on January the 6th, I started. And of course, what I started on was yes. It was literally, oh, you now are the Synclavier guy. Here's yes. So, which was the Big Generator album, which I was the follow-up to Owner of a Lonely Heart. And so I worked for Trevor, which was, an amazing experience. SARM at the time was, it was the sort of coolest studio in the world, probably. He was probably the coolest producer at the time.
Yeah.
And I got to do things like, I didn't work on Slave to the Rhythm. That's Lippo and Trevor and everybody else, but I did get to work on some of the remixes. I remember I and Julian Mendelssohn, who's another great engineer, we all, we would sit there and then cut everything up and make interesting things out of whatever was going on. And you got to do some really strange things. I did, for some reason, I remember, I was on a George Michael single called A Different Corner, which is a very cool thing, which we happened to throw. He wanted some Synclavier on it, so I threw that on. And then there was some more Frankie Goes to Hollywood. There were Godley and Cream and all these other things. And at some point, I decided that I wasn't a good employee, and I think they decided that too. Um, so I left and I went freelance.
Okay,
And
but before we get to the freelance, let's go back a little bit because you just skip over a few things there. So,
right,
first of all, Lippo is Steve Lipson, and people
yes,
haven't heard of Steve, go look him up. He was Trevor's engineer for quite a while, right? And an amazing, amazing engineer.
and an amazing producer. You listen to the stuff he did with Annie Lennox; it's exquisite.
Yeah,
Lippo he gave me one amazing piece of advice when I was 21 or something like that at this point. And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be a producer. I'm going to do films. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." And he said to me, "Well, why don't you just do one thing well?" And it was probably at that point the best piece of advice I got,
so
which
now
is
you've
that.
completely ignored it for the rest of your career and done everything well, but that's okay.
But no, I think, but at that point, there is this wonderful thing, which is that you get those business cards which have the backslashes on them: producer, singer, composer, songwriter, business impresario, and so on. All of those things. And when you look at them, you say, well, that person probably can't do any of them particularly well because they're trying to do too many things. And what Lippo said to me was effectively, try and put on one hat at the beginning, because at your age, that's all that's going to fit. And he was right.
Right.
And the Synclavier was obviously a big thing for me. That was transformative. I have an advantage, I'd say, that in the way that I play studio rather than playing keyboards or anything like that.
Yeah.
The way that you and I think we think alike in these regards. But I don't think when I use music computers at all. It's totally natural. I just, the way that there are some great pianists for whom there is no sort of intersection between their brain and their fingers. It just flows straight through. There's no thought. I feel the same way about using computers and music in general. The way that the Synclavier fell into that, into this perfect place for me, which was that allowed me to be a musician, and it allowed me to use a computer to make music. And
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, and it was incredible, and it really was transformative for me.
Well, I think one of the things about the Synclavier, and for me, it's the same with Pro Tools, though other people find it convoluted and dark. But the Synclavier was obviously an incredibly powerful machine. It had a CPU that was 10 years ahead of its time, to the point where Jet Propulsion Labs actually bought one and used it for camera control on one of the Mars landers. So it's like the technology behind it was insane, but what made it work was the interface. It was a keyboard with hundreds of buttons that were dedicated to functions, and it took a little bit of time to learn, but not as much as you would think. The fact that you could go home, read the manuals, come in and start working, it was the perfect marriage of what it could do was amazing, but it had a human interface that made sense. You very quickly understood how the Synclavier thought. And I think that's the hallmark of any good piece of technology, is once you get the concept, rather than going through the manual to find out what it can do, you go through the manual to find out, well, how do you make it do the thing you know it can do? Because it must be able to do that. And it's just, what's the keystroke? What's the button push? So the Synclavier was absolutely genius at that. And it took me years to forget how to use it. Now I couldn't. I could probably get into a menu or something, but that's about it. Do you still have your Synclavier?
I still have my Synclavier. It's sitting in my in LA, in my studio in LA, and it's glorious. There is this weird thing, which is that probably because I'm being a keyboard player, it has that same feel, which it had these hundreds of 96 buttons, all from the Concorde, and it had the one knob. But because the sequencer and the sound creator were all effectively integrated together, it meant that there was this natural connection between them. And for instance, I'm working on a project with a sound designer called Chris Boyes, who still uses the Synclavier every day. because it is his axe for creating sound, sound effects. And the for me, I mean, first of all, I think you and I would both agree it's the best sounding sampler there has ever been.
Yeah, and it's also the only truly sample accurate sequencer.
Yeah.
Well, probably Waveframe was the same, but if you wanted something louder, you'd copy the sequencer track, and it would be louder instead of flamming.
Yeah, it was the amazing thing was when I have like a Sony 3348 at home. I was working with the Synclavier, and I could just play the input and the Sony 3348 together. And as you said, everything just got louder because it was so perfectly in sync.
Yeah.
For me, the thing about the Synclavier was that it didn't have the things the Fairlight had. I could use the Fairlight, but because it didn't have cut and paste initially and copy, those were things that didn't happen. So my sequencing style was developed by the fact that I actually had to play things from the beginning to the end. And so if you listen to the things that I programmed over the years, if you listen to, say, Unbreak My Heart or any of those things, when you listen to the drums, when I'm playing the hi-hats, I didn't cut and paste hi-hats.
Yeah.
I play them so that they flow through the track. And that, I think, is a hallmark of some of the work that I did on the Synclavier, which was that things would evolve so that I would do the thing with the cymbals. I would start the cymbal. I had some favorite cymbal sounds, but I would pitch them up 2 semitones because that was right, push the button. And I'd start playing them at the beginning of the track. They would be 2 semitones higher. Then around towards the middle of the song, I'd take them down a semitone and they would now be on a new track and I would put them down. And then at the end, I would put them and play them at their original key. And that lightened the cymbals up at the beginning of the song and gradually made them bigger. I had a thing which was, even though it did have quantizing, obviously, and the groove of the machine was amazing. I would do a thing where I push my kick drums 3 milliseconds ahead. It just would do this thing where it would push the track a tiny bit so that you just felt like the downbeat was just pushing ahead of the beat. The hi-hats I'd often push a millisecond ahead so that you just got that sense of urgency so that everything didn't feel the same way. I still do that today. It's that thing of pushing things so that things have that sense of anticipation. And the Synclavier was incredibly good for that.
Yeah, and I think going back to the copy and paste thing, I think it took them so long to put it in because you could copy the sequencer track and then slide the copy. So you could slide the copy 32 bars if you really wanted to fly something from the first chorus to the second chorus. So you could do it. And I think that because it was built by musicians, they just were thinking, well, why would you want to copy and paste? Go get your MPC 60 out if you want to do pattern-based stuff. This isn't that. So before we move on from SARM, because I'm a geek and this is my show, so I can talk about anything I want. I just want to hear a little bit more about Yes. Now, I'm a huge, huge Yes fan. I would say that 90125 and then Big Generator were sort of the beginning of the end for me. But that's just because I was a fan of the earlier stuff, whatever. It's a different era. But I love the Trevor Rabin thing that he brought to that. Now, he famously, the demos for Run Over Lonely Heart have all the samples, have that arrangement and things like that. I'm curious, just to ask about somebody else, because you may know, how did he do his demos? Because obviously he was very technologically advanced for a guitar player. He wasn't just writing songs on guitar. He was demoing at the level that now people expect you to demo at, but nobody demoed like that back then, really. That was what you did in the studio. So what did he come in with and how did that translate to the record? And just curious a little bit about that.
Well, I spent about 8 months on Big Generator before Trevor Horn got asked to leave. And they, for some reason at the time, I spoke to John Anderson about it later. They decided to take my name off the credits along with a couple of other people due to some really weird stuff, which is for another day. But I spent 8 months. I was a 21-year-old. It was great. Trevor Rabin was amazing. I remember they had spent maybe 4 or 5 months over Castle Caramati, if I remember rightly, which was this Italian castle with an engineer there. They brought everything back to Psalm, and they'd been working for a few months when I got onto the album. And I was working in one room. There was a number of like day-to-day engineers, and in those days we had house engineers and house tape ops, and we had a house, there was a number of things, so that I was the house programmer effectively for Trevor. And Trevor Horn, sorry, Trevor Rabin would obviously had a very, very clear idea of a lot of what he wanted to do. If you take a track like Big Generator, that was cut a number of times, as was a number of the other songs. And I can tell you that there's a whole load of stuff. I remember ripping CDs like crazy. You can hear a bit of, if I remember rightly, Tombeau de Couperin by Ravel. At the beginning, there's a sample, little flute,
Right.
everything, right? At the beginning of that, that's because I went out, grabbed some samples and just threw those in there. Obviously, I can't remember which particular version of Tombeau de Couperin it was, but it was
I'm sure
on
it
there.
was cleared properly and credited.
Absolutely,
on
everything was those days.
Wink.
But that by then there was now digital tape. And I think digital tape made all the difference in the world, because we had two 3324s. We didn't have 48 tracks at that point. But because we had two synchronized 24 tracks, you could do this thing of bouncing stuff across. Now, they were really painful because you had to format the tape from beginning to end, which took an hour. And there was the poor tape op, another spike, not Spike Stent, another spike. And the engineer Dave Megan and so on they were just under piles. I think if I remember rightly, there were 170 reels of tape by the time, at the point that things left, and they took it back to America after they'd left Psalm. But because there was digital tape, it meant that he could play 24 tracks of guitar, because the Rabin was obviously an incredible guitarist, but also had that particular sound that involved a lot of those sort of harmonizer type lines, but not harmonizer. He was playing all the harmonies within them, and then layering and layering and layering and layering and layering, and then bouncing down. But without that loss that we were so used to, which was what was happening with 24 track analog tape, even with Dolby SR and all the rest of it. This was digital tape made a huge difference, because we could then all have slaves that we could work off that were great. And at no point were you going to suffer from the other problem, which is that when you work for 6 months, 9 months, a year, 18 months on tapes, they start to wear out.
Yeah.
And that was the problem that was always happening with the material. Like, in the old days when everybody was using 2-inch analog, and it's glorious and it sounds wonderful and I love it. But there's a point where it starts to wear out when you played it too much. And that was a big issue for something like Trevor Horn, because nothing happened in a day.
Right.
Everything took time.
I remember on some larger budget projects where we would actually safety the master 2-inch immediately, and then we would never put it on the machine again until it was time to mix. And by the time you put it back up on the machine, you're like, oh my God, it sounds that good. I mean, the degradation over even just 6 weeks of overdubbing and running that tape back and forth, you're scraping it over the heads.
I think people don't understand quite that. Everyone sort of eulogizes analog, quite rightly so, it sounds beautiful, but they forget about the downsides. That thing of editing 2-inch tape, those probably, aligning the reel, the number of times I've seen a poor tape op wipe an entire song or an entire thing because they happened to be aligning the machine and got distracted, made a phone call, and there was 3 minutes of a masterpiece wiped. So there are all these things that we sort of we've got used to the fact that we have now everything permanently, beautifully backed up. That wasn't always the way. It used to be
No, I remember getting on planes with tapes and thinking, this is a terrible idea. Like, this is it. I have the album with me. So,
well, I mean, to think about long projects, I mean, imagine, because we both, one of the times that we saw each other again was Michael Jackson, and you'd been on it for how long when I joined?
Well, overall, I was on it for almost 18 months, I think.
Yeah, so you've probably been on it 9 months.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was 18 months. Yeah, it was nuts. And it was half in New York and then half back in LA. And the number of tapes on that were insane, because that was all track 2 analog and then immediately bounced to 3348. That was Bruce's thing.
Yeah.
On that record.
And I joined you in New York after I was finishing Streisand. Oh no, I just come in for Streisand, and I joined you, and then we had months of fun at Hit Factory.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to that. We got a couple of things to go. All right. So just real quick, before we leave the SARM thing, I just want to say one of my favorite little pieces of trivia that involves Yes and Trevor is that he's the only person not named John Anderson to sing lead on a Yes album. He did. Yeah. Drama is the only record John did not sing until, now, when John's not necessarily with the band. But anyway, so as you were going to talk about a while ago before I sidetracked you, so you left SARM when you realized you did not want to be an employee, which is a really interesting way to put it, but I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I'm exactly the same way. At one point, I really needed some work, and I took a job as a tech at a recording studio, and I gave my 2 weeks notice after 3 days. I just knew that was not going to work. So you went freelance, and what did you do?
Well, I did. No, the first thing, of course, was by then I thought I knew everything.
As every 20-something-year-old does.
Yeah. I started doing 2 things. One was, which we both met each other the first time, on which was I started writing commercials.
Yeah.
And because they could afford Synclaviers, and that was the big deal, so, and I was a guy who could use one. And therefore, eventually I started writing jingles. And for all of the downside, I have to say at that time in my life, it was incredibly useful for me because it made me fast. I had just gone through a year with Trevor of swimming through molasses because nothing was fast. I remember one of the most complicated things I've ever done was a drum track where I sampled bits of Alan White's drums and I put them together and done a whole load of things. And I was moving things down literally by nanoseconds. As you remember the Synclavier, you could move things literally by tiniest of macros. I was moving things around. After 10 days, I had created a drum track. I'd literally been slicing 5 tracks of 2 bars of drums to make a drum track. Now, we didn't have multi-track sampling then, but so what I would have to do was effectively try and line up the 5 samples that were connected. But then obviously the tail of the snare had to go with the tail of the tail of the snare had to go with the snare it was connected to. So this had taken 10 days of 19-hour days. Part of the reason I left SARM also was the fact that there was a point where I did 4.5 months of 19-hour days. No, 18-hour days. Sorry, my assistant was doing 19-hour days because he was breaking down and starting up. And I looked like I was on smack. We were really going through it. But anyway, so the Synclavier was working for Trevor. 10 days on a drum track? Nah. At the end of the 10 days, they went, this is really, really cool, but we've changed our mind. We're going to record the song again.
Right.
Throw it away. Then I started doing commercials, and it was like, you have 3 hours to do a jazz track. You have 3 hours to do a bit of Vivaldi. You want some heavy rock? That's fine. Okay. You need to do this. And so everything was quick. What's a bass drum? Not which of the 400 bass drums shall we choose, and shall we check that every single thing should be perfect? And because of that, all of that stuff happened. I started getting really, really quick on the Synclavier. And at the same time, so I was doing that, and that was earning me a decent amount of money writing jingles. And I started producing. I think there were some weird things. I produced a guy called Nick Kamen, who's famous because he was the man who took off his jeans in a Levi's advert. And he made there was this famous advert where he was in the laundrette, and he made an album. I did some tracks with him. Then I did a incredible singer called Billy Mackenzie. There was a band called The Associates, Billy Mackenzie may be one of the 3 or 4 best singers I've ever had the honor of working with. Incredible. He unfortunately committed suicide a few years ago. But I made an album with The Associates, and then I started writing songs. I was producing some other things, and I had a hit in America as a songwriter. And at this point, Synclavier phoned me up and said, "We want you to own a Synclavier."
Which, of course, they wanted everyone to own a Synclavier. In case for people who don't know, I think entry level was getting close to 100 grand, and really you were at 150 to 200 for a big blown out system.
And I said, "I can't afford a Synclavier." And they said, "We'll make it worth your while. We'll make you and we have this shop soiled system that we would like you to buy." And I went, and I looked at it, and the price, I mean, it was eye watering. I think it was $140,000. Which, this is 1986, 1987. This was more than a house. This was huge amounts of money. And they said, "Well, we'll sort this out. You should own a Synclavier." But it was half the price of what it should be. And this system should have been $240,000, $250,000. And so I got myself in deep. I bought the system. And at some point, Synclavier said, "We've got this American engineer who needs a programmer." And by then I was producing records and stuff. And I said, "I don't do that anymore. I'm a producer. I know everything." And they said, "Oh, please, please." And so I said, "Okay." So he's worked with Michael Jackson. He's worked with all these other people. He's really good. And so I went out to this wonderful residential studio called The Manor, which was a beautiful place in Oxfordshire that was owned by Richard Branson. It's where Tubular Bells was recorded and so on.
Yeah, there's just remember exactly where you are, but for people watching, there's a fantastic documentary of XTC cutting a song at that studio, and Richard is there stocking the pond. But you can see a lot about the studio. It's pretty amazing.
Very cool studio.
Sorry.
And the engineer was a guy called Humberto Gatica, who we both know. Humberto is incredibly talented engineer, and was the exact opposite of everybody I'd met at SARM, who were very much more. The SARM guys weren't the Abbey Road type with white coats, but they came from that English perspective. They were very, and Humberto was that Latin thing, but he was totally intuitive in a way that I've very rarely seen. He had this picture of how a mix should be, and I would see him make these microscopic movements on sounds that I thought were great, and suddenly the sound would just fit beautifully into whatever I'd done. The same way that Sweden, Bruce, I think you and I would feel the same way about that. That we thought we created an incredible sound, and then Bruce would just do this tiniest of things, and suddenly the sound would just glow. And so Humberto and I started working together, and he said to me, "You don't program like anybody else. You need to move to LA. You need to come to LA, and I need to introduce you to people." And I was having a really good time with him, because this was also, they brought over some players from LA. There was I think John Robinson. I'd met him for the first time there, was playing drums. Nathan was playing bass. It was that sort of thing, and so I was meeting all these players who were obviously fabulous players, but it was also that atmosphere that I was really enjoying. And so I thought about it, and at the time, the British music was full of things like Stock Aitken and Waterman, which wasn't my favorite form of music. And I looked at it and thought, well, why not? And so I then, a few months later, I decided to get on a plane and go to LA.
And were you still writing jingles at that point in the UK? And
still producing records and stuff. But I decided there was a point where you have to gamble on yourself, and I think we've both been there. You take risks because you decide whether you have what it takes to go to the next level. And I got to LA, and I phoned up Hum and I said, "Hey, I'm here." He said, "That's great. Come to Lion's Share. I need you now." I thought, wow, this is incredible. So I go to Lion's Share Studios and I do a session at Lion's Share with Humberto. I've got off the plane at like 12 o'clock. I'm in the studio at 3 p.m.
And Lion's Share was one of the studios in LA that actually had a Synclavier in-house.
Yeah. Yes. And then I finish with him upstairs. I think we were working on a record with a guy called Chucky Booker, who was an incredible keyboard player, singer. I'm walking down the stairs and I hear, "Simon!" And I go, "What?" And there is this big bear, John Robinson, JR, in the background going, "I need you here. I need you here. Come over here." And so I go into this other studio that was owned by, John Arias. I think it was a B&J Studios with Barbara and John. I think it was Arias. I don't think. Anyway, they had a studio underneath Lion's Share.
Right.
And they needed me to, they said, "Oh, we need you to do this, program us." And John, and so I couldn't, so I've got off the plane. 3 p.m. I've done my first session. 9 p.m. I'm now doing my second session. And I finish at 2 a.m. I think, my God, this is incredible. I don't work for 6 months after that. And this is the point. Pretty well. John, and then Humberto says, "You got to ship out your Synclavier. You got to ship out all your synths. You got to ship everything out." So I ship everything out, and then the phone stops ringing, and I commute back and forth between America and Britain. I'm using the jingles to pay for me staying in LA. And somebody said something very, very clear to me. He said, "They're waiting to see whether you survive the first 6 months before they take you seriously." Everybody goes to LA going, "Oh, I'm going to be the biggest this, I'm going to do that." And everyone goes, yeah, this is great, brilliant. And then they expect everybody to go home and never come back again, because that's normally what happens. And it was important for me that I survived that 6 months, and which I did. And then Humberto, 6 months later, said, "You got to come and meet my friend David, who needs you." And there was this guy called David Foster, who was an American record producer. And at that time, David was in one of the dips of careers that everybody goes through. Everybody goes through these things. Nobody does that. Absolutely nobody. Quincy was doing Ironside. That everybody has their time when they are doing something else. And so David came over to where I was living, and I had my Synclavier set up in Laurel Canyon, and we started working together. Now, I think, we hit it off pretty immediately, I think. And there was a couple of things that were important, I think. One is that I came from punk. My natural music that I grew up with was The Damned. It was and that was my band. It was also the post-punk, the Killing Jokes of this world, the Teardrop Explodes, New Order, those sorts of things. That was everything that I came from. But home had always been the fact that I was in London when punk hit. I was young, but I did go and see all of these bands when I was young, and I would sneak into the 100 Club and the Ballroom, Electric Ballroom, and so on places, and see some of this stuff. And I was talking with my brother the other day, who is another musician, I was reminding him about, people sitting there worrying about social distancing, about the hail of spit that used to go, that we would inflict on the band whenever we used to, go to these gigs. But anyway, back from the hairless spit, back to David Foster. I don't mean to be in any way to be connected. So David and I were working on I think the first thing I did was was a beautiful song that was going to be for Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. Brian then in the end decided that he wasn't going to sing it. But the reason I'm talking about the punk is that I think that David natural home was jazz, the sort of R&B and jazz, although obviously he had that Earth, Wind and Fire thing, which I enjoy most of his playing.
Yeah, Chicago too. I mean, the first phase of his career was pretty badass and different.
Yeah, and every so often when I would work with him, I would see that the full R&B, which is I always found the most fun of what he did. But he had an inclination to go a bit too soft, I think, sometimes. And I think that if there's anything I brought to him was a slightly an edgier attitude to the way that I wanted to work. And I think that sort of worked for us both. And so gradually we started working more and more together. And we had a sort of an agreement, not agreement, it was just what happened is he would play down a piano, which would always be, glorious. He has this wonderful sense of internal work in terms of his chords that you can feel that Bill Evans background there in terms of the way that he works. I always loved those. It was the stuff that happened in between his fingers more than the stuff around the edge.
Right.
And then I would start doing the drums, and then we would either he or I would play the bass, and then gradually we'd evolve. And sometimes I'd play strings, sometimes he plays strings, sometimes we do all the pads and stuff like that. And usually after a day and a half, we had a track. Then Dean Parks and Michael Thompson and whoever else would come and play guitar. And then the backing singers would come in, the Sue-Ann Caldwells and whoever else it was would do the backing singers. Then the lead singer would come in, vocal on if we'd started on Monday, vocals on Thursday, fixed vocals on Friday, and then off to be mixed. And we were just churning these out. And gradually things changed for him, I think, when with Natalie Cole. He did this Natalie Cole album, The Unforgettable duet with her dad.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the next thing we did after that was The Bodyguard.
Right.
I think that, and The Bodyguard was again, that was at that point just transformative again. I keep using that word, but for him as well, in that it was I think it just sort of settled. And I didn't do I Will Always Love You. I know the story of I Will Always Love You. I can tell you exactly the story. But that was played by the live guys down in Florida, I think, if I remember rightly. And then Dave Reitzers did a mix until that was finished. But I did do the others. I did the I Have Nothings and Run to You and so on. There is I Have Nothing has no hi-hat on it.
All right.
I played a hi-hat. It was great. Somehow it didn't end up on the tape. And I think if it was, remember rightly, it was Mick was mixing that. Gazowski, I think Gazowski mixed it. And we got a phone call saying, yeah, where's the hi-hat? and went, oh, I'm not sure why. He said, well, it sounds great, but did you mean to leave it off? And I was sitting there going, and then we checked and realized that somehow it had ended up not on tape, which tells you that
this is pre-Dropbox. You can't just like, oh, I'll send it to you. You would have had to make a tape, send it. He'd have to get a second machine, lock it up, fly the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And you listen to it. It's wonderful. I love that record. The fact that there's no hi-hat makes no difference.
Now, do you think it's better because of it, or it's just different?
I think it makes no difference.
No difference. It's
fine. I don't think. Yeah, go on.
Whatever's given, he'll make it work.
I don't think anybody cares. No. I think that they were listening to Whitney, which would probably keep most people happy.
Yeah,
they weren't listening to my hi-hat.
Well, they should have. You should do a remix. Just put your hi-hat over the top of the original so we can all hear it. I think.
And then listen, you're gone.
Well, I was just going to say that is a transformative. Obviously, the record was gigantic, and the singles from it were gigantic. But it, for a second, sort of reestablished something that you had from the 30s up through the 50s, which was this sort of crossover movie star, pop star. Because I mean, you think about how many amazing songs were introduced to the world by people known as actors or dancers, because they were in the movies and the songs are written for the movies. And there was a little bit of that. And I think that was something that was very nostalgic in a way, while being incredibly new. Like musically, it ushered in that genre of pop in a way. But it was a real throwback to have her be that big a part of everything that went along with the movie, I think.
Yeah, and there was a thing that there are very few people who have that level of I don't know, just that star quality, which is when I remember we were working at, I think, I want to say Encore Studios, and when she walked in to do the vocals, and it was like this sort of, this she was like 6 feet tall, and walking perfectly dressed, walked in, and then this voice appeared, and it was just ridiculous the way that it's like with Michael, that there's that, not only the do not touch me, but the aura that seems to come with certain of the people,
where they're so fabulously talented at so many different things, but it's never surprising. It's like, oh yeah, of course she can dance. Oh, she can act. Oh, like, well, and another one is Barbra Streisand, obviously, which we should talk about for a second, because that's another place where we crisscross. But you'd been working with her a bit before that, so you could bring it.
That was again with David. It was. I mean, there was a couple of things. I'd done an album with her, with David Foster producing, and I was doing the programming and so on, which was Back to Broadway, and at some point, and Barbra, there are some things, that her voice. There are certain voices that just don't make sense. That that does not compute. That how can someone sing like that? And I remember we did an incredible Bill Ross arrangement called "Everybody Says Don't," and another one I remember doing something with a beautiful thing over at what used to be Ocean Way, and Speak Low, where she would sing, and you couldn't understand the idea. People don't sort of, because everybody's so used to now everybody's slicing everything into little pieces and auto-tuning this, that, and the other. We didn't have auto-tune at that point. Singers sang, and then if they sang it out of tune, they had to sing it again. With Barbra, it was a
3,000 out, or you'd slice it up and put it in the Synclavier for a day. But sing it again.
And there was the reason that you would have the take after a take after take after take to get it great, because there wasn't that the joke that was terrible, thanks, you're done, which we have now. But Barbra was the thing where she wanted to sing live with the orchestra, obviously, so that I had to work out a way of making the Synclavier track live with a conductor, which I found a bizarre way that was based on the strangest of ways, but I found a way.
The click input. On the sync
of creating effectively, I could create a live click that would drive the Synclavier sequencer, and that allowed me to then follow Bill Ross or whoever was conducting, and I could, so you could go and you have to do that because Barbra, the orchestra doesn't follow Bill. Bill is following Barbra, and everything tempo-wise comes from Barbra. So you can't pre-create any of this stuff because it has to flow from the artist. And I think that a lot of people miss the idea that it used to be that when everybody played live, everybody was feeding off everybody else. And Barbra is the sort of prime example of where everything came from one source, which was Barbra. The timing came from it, and the sense of emotion and everything else. For all of the ups and downs and everything else that have, she had this incredible voice. And so we'd done this album, and at some point, I get this phone call from her saying, yeah, I'm going to do President Clinton's inauguration. Do you want to come and, accompany me? And, yeah, okay, why not?
Yeah, yes.
It turns out this is her first live show in 27 years.
So basically, since we last worked with her.
Yeah. So this is 1993, I think, and she is doing her first live show in 27 years. And so I have for President Clinton's inauguration concert. And I say, right, so we start rehearsing. I have to go to Washington, D.C., and it's me and Bill Ross. Bill Ross in conducting, I'm doing all the keyboard stuff and everything else. And then there is a pickup band to go with this. And then we discover that actually this is happening in the 20,000 seat arena. And this is the point I have to tell you that was my first gig.
Really?
I never played gigs. I always just record. Even when I was 13, when I started work, I was working at home.
But to be fair, I mean, the shows we did in Vegas were technically live shows. And what year was that? That would have been 90. Was that before?
95? But that happened after. But that happened after. Yeah. So the inauguration. This is what happened. Is I did the inauguration with her. Some of it live, some of it with some sequencing in there, and she enjoyed herself so much.
Right.
She then said, "Hey, you know what? Maybe I can do another live show." And then MGM were opening the MGM Grand.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she said, well, maybe I could do that. So we did the MGM Grand, which is where you and I saw each other again at the MGM Grand. And that was a combination of live, I was using some sequencing and some live stuff and everything else, but it was a full show.
Yeah.
And she had so much, and that was for New Year's Eve, whatever, 94, 95, 96, maybe something like that. Anyway, she enjoyed that so much because there were 20,000 people cheering and enjoying it.
New Year's Eve 95, actually.
95, yeah.
Whatever.
And he said, oh, maybe I could go on tour. So I did that first comeback tour with her, which was my first and only tour.
Wow.
Which I understand why I don't do live music. There are some people for whom that idea of playing the same song again and again is great. I don't get that. I don't get the buzz from it the same way. Okay, it's great. The audience goes, cheer. Yes, wonderful.
Yeah.
But that same song going through your head, feelings, whatever it was, every song, all of these things would just keep going through the night. And I don't do that. I like the fresh challenge. I like the fact that if you look at my career through everything, one of the things is I have the curiosity gene, and I'm always looking for something else to do, probably to my detriment to some degree. But the point was that I did the one tour and that was enough. I was never going to do another tour. It's just not me. I love the studio. I love the whole creative process that happens when you're creating it in de novo in the beginning. I don't like the repetitive stuff. Live stuff just doesn't do anything for me at all.
Right. That's interesting. So we could just talk about records and David Foster and all that, but I want to get to your film career. So from what I read on the internet, which is obviously all incredibly accurate,
Totally true.
Yeah, very true. Is that the first films you worked on were with John Barry? Is that right? Or had you done some film stuff before, but he was the first major composer?
I'd done a little bit. There was I think David Foster had we did one film score. I did that with him. But then I met John Barry on the soundtrack to Dances with Wolves, which would be a good thing to meet John Barry on.
Yeah, that's not bad. And you came in at the tail end of the score to work on the soundtrack album, right? Or did you work on the score?
Exactly. No, I was working right at the end on the soundtrack album. And John, I mean, first of all, being British, then there are certain gods of British music, and John Barry, you know, you take John and you take James Bond, you take everything else, and you take that. So this is a you know, somebody for whom I just, you know, I am not worthy. We just hit it off. I mean, we just had a wonderful working relationship for many, many years, and he was my, you know, I can say genuinely my first real mentor. He was a wonderful human being. The best stories, absolutely,
I'll bet.
bar none. And also there was, you know, you suddenly realize, you know, that he'd won 5 Oscars, and you worked out why. He took no bullshit from anyone. He had a righteous opinion of himself, quite rightly so, and but he understood the emotional connection of music to screen. I think probably better than anyone. And I haven't worked with John Williams, but even if I take, you know, my close relationship with James Horner, and, you know, I'd worked with Howard Shore and Alan Silvestri and so on. And so John Barry had that understanding of what that connection. He said he used to remember that when he was a little boy, his dad owned a cinema in Leeds. He said he used to stare up at the screen when he was a little boy at this big black and white image and just remember what, you know, and fall in love with the thing. And you always got the feeling that his music was fell in love with the film that it was written to. And I remember very clearly, I did work with him on Chaplin, which was a wonderful, wonderful film, with Robert Downey Jr. And it was, you know, it was just an amazing experience. And there was this sense of pain that he brought to his scores, and joy. And I think that in these days of film scores that tend to be the chuggomatic machines where you have the one finger, which we can all do, the idea of a score actually having an emotional connection, that sense of the heartbeat of the film, I think is something that is somewhat missing a lot in a lot of scores these days.
I think it comes around though, because it's like Chernobyl is a good example of, obviously not traditional in that so much of the sound design was sound design, but musically it's a more traditional score in a way, and that the music is a very, as opposed to this is an action scene, so we need rhythmic elements because those mean action. This is a musical setting that enhances the emotion that's already there, as opposed to trying to like hammer you over the head with it. So maybe that's coming around. I mean, you know better than me, but obviously styles change, you know, and
Yes, of course.
some things that people were doing like on every single television show for the last 10 years all of a sudden sound really dated because you've heard somebody do something that's more organic and more theme oriented as opposed to rhythmically oriented and stuff like that. And John, I mean, I can't imagine that he ever went for a fad. He just wrote what he wrote.
Yes, and he had this idea of the golden tempos, which were, if you listen to him, he believed that that he would write. We used to do this thing where instead of being beats per minute, we would do frames per beat, and so you would and he had this idea of these whole number of frames per beat gave a certain golden tempo, so that like 90, 72, 60, 48, 120 were perfect numbers of frames per beat, and he would write his cues very much along those lines, of using those sense of that. But then again, there wasn't really a click track. What was actually happening was there would be a count off, and then he would be conducting to the picture, and so that you can see it. That what happens is that as an image, there was a point where we've cut a couple of seconds out of this scene, John. Yeah, okay, I'll conduct a bit faster here. And then again, we were in a different time because again, he was working with the Moviola. He was still working with film. The first films I ever worked on, you had these enormous machines. So you'd hear this great, as all of the reels and reels of film all racked up, and they all synchronized together. And it was an incredible thing to listen to, as that, and maybe 5 24 tracks and a 48 track would all synchronize.
Right, printing back to mag.
And
yeah.
And the and I think that he sort of basically when they made edits to the film, that was a big deal. Generally, he would say, "You give me a finished film, and I give me 3 months to write 4 months to write my score." And because the edit was still a physical edit of film,
Right.
Nowadays, we're making changes right up to the last day. I was making changes the day before the print master was made on Avatar. And that is the final. So on November the 22nd, I was making changes, and the final print master was made on 23rd, and it was in the cinema on December the 18th.
Why such a slow turnaround?
These days it's quicker. These days, I remember on Spectre, it was 10 days from the end of the dub to being in the cinemas. So things speed up.
So let's talk about, I want to definitely get to James Horner, because obviously there's a big part of your career and things like that.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about Howard Shore for a second, because from, again, what I've read on the internet, you came in on 7 to do the sound design. So the craziness of that score was what you were brought in to help with. Is that true? And then, so what was your role, and how'd you do it, and how did that work with the more musical elements?
I think, if I'm real, Howard and I had worked together on a couple of scores before that. But 7 was a particular thing. Howard was really a creative person. He really wanted me to use the studio as an instrument, and he would do this thing where he would throw up all of the effects on the end of the board. And I think John Richards, if I remember rightly, was recording this at the time. And then he would just throw the faders up on the H3000 harmonizer, and on there would be the 1580 delays and whatever else, and just to see what would happen. But what he asked me to do was see, right, how do we make this sound a bit more, dangerous, more interesting? So that one of the things I did was I took all the violin parts, and I found samples of brake drum squeals that sound as squealing brakes. And I tuned all the squealing brakes up so that they now pitched with the violins, so that when you hear them, with the violins are playing, but there are these brake squeals,
Right.
and they're not typical. They vary in pitch. They're not perfect. They're not auto-tuned, and they're also really fingernails across blackboard nasty. And I would play them against the violin lines, so that all of the lead violin lines have these brake squeals played behind them. I would do other things with different other sounds, so that the orchestra was getting manipulated in a way that would make it sound much more aggressive and dangerous. I would start using fuzz boxes to the point where I put the entire orchestra through a fuzz box, which I think is probably, it sounds like, it was, these days, everybody does that. But then it was trying to do something different. And so I was driving Neve mic pre's on the desk, overloading everything, try and get that grit in there, and then putting things. And this was to the traditional score. Obviously, there was all of the stuff that was coming from Nine Inch Nails and from the soundtrack stuff.
Yeah.
But the score had to have that same element of aggression. And it sounded stupid, but at the time I was known for doing grungy stuff. I not only did 7, I did the Cronenberg Crash, which was another one where I was manipulating things like crazy. And for all of the beautiful, nice stuff I was known for in pop, the David Foster, the Celines and the Quincy and everything else like that. The film stuff, not counting John Barry, was mainly tended to be, I was being brought in to make things as nasty as possible, to give you that grit and the darkness.
Amazing. So, all right. So James Horner, we gotta go there. So just, that's all I need to say. I said his name. Now you can talk about him.
So I think, in terms of biggest influences on me, I would say James is the biggest influence on me. Not only that, he was my closest friend. I miss him every day. It's funny that, he was he was a family friend, to the point where if the phone rang and James called and he would just chat to my son, or he would talk to my wife. It was normal for him to just talk to us. And he was, there are things that, that if you think about just the 100 films he's done, or 120 or 140 films, and for all of the stuff that everybody says, everybody is always, so saying, well, he repeated himself. So does most people.
Well,
Anyway,
John Williams repeated Ravel, so there you go.
Yeah. It's not even, it's that James is another one who just, first of all, he loved film. He loved the way that the image, what happened to the image and what he could do to it. And he had this incredible sense of space in a score. That sounds stupid, but these days we hear lots of scores where there is this density, where everything is compressed. There is that 1% of distortion that has been added to make it feel a little bit crunchier and grunchier, and everything else, to the overall score, and everything has got that slightly compressed in your face feel. And James came from this other idea, which was that if you listen to his writing, often what is actually happening is that there are these two lines there usually is this sense of the lead line and the bass line working against each other, and they just sort of weave against each other, and the stuff in the middle is there just to sort of support it. And in some ways that's very similar to the way that John Barry worked. There's always this famous Mahler quote, I think it was, about the ear can only hear three things at any one time. And I've always taken that to heart, that you can't overdo, you can't try and expect the ear to hear too much. But James and John, they had one thing in common, and they both actually liked each other's music a lot, which was that their sense of melody. There was a thematic, the themes that you listen, if you listen to James's themes, often they are these long elegiac lines that sort of evolve and come back, but they're always there to bring you closer to the film. And the first thing I did with him was Titanic, and I was working with Alan Silvestri. I think I did a number of films with Alan. I just done, I think, Contact with Alan at that point, and they called me, and he had this. They had the same agent, and they phoned me up and said, James Horner would like to meet you and talk to you about Titanic, in this film Titanic. Now, Titanic was the film that was going to bring down Fox and Paramount Pictures. It was going to destroy both studios because it was
the iceberg, basically.
It is difficult to describe to people these days how scared everybody was when we were working on Titanic. And there was no money, none. Somehow they had found, money to get demos done, inverted commas. Now, to put the context to this, and I know this is, we're now long enough away that nobody's going to care. The budget was $300,000 for the score. Given that an orchestra day costs $100,000,
yeah,
you get an idea, and that was because that was where the budget had been, and everybody thought that the budget will get bigger, but it didn't, because at this point Fox and Paramount weren't going to spend a dime more. And as there's one certainty in all of film music, which is that we will never get more money, because we are the last thing that happens.
Yeah.
They have already spent the money on the champagne at the beginning. They have already spent the money on the explosions, and that didn't work. They have spent everything else, and there are a million other things that happen. so the last thing that happens is the music, which is at the point where they're trying to save money everywhere.
Yeah.
So music never gets spent, never gets an extra dime. But what they had found was a little bit of money for demos. And I was the guy who could make a Synclavier sound like an orchestra. I had done a film with Alan Silvestri called Fern Gully, where I had played the entire score in the Synclavier, every single note. There were Alan had written it, Bill Ross had orchestrated it, I played it, and it went down. And so they called me and said, you know, we've got some demo money. And what actually happened was that I then ended up being the guy that recorded all the synths and played the synths with Ian Underwood. There was Ian Underwood, who was we could take a year just talking about the awesomeness of Ian Underwood. Ian Underwood, just so we know, so everybody knows, he's one of the original mothers of invention.
Yeah.
He is da 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 in Close Encounters. He is the guy that played that. He is we would constantly say to Ian, it says that you were the in Blade Runner. He said, I was. He said, well, maybe I might have done that. And there'd be, Ian, it says you were. And there would be this constant thing of Ian. We would discover all these thousands of things that Ian had done.
Unbelievable.
And the nicest human being on the planet.
And just his career playing Mini Moog with Frank is enough. Like, he didn't
exactly. Yeah. And so Ian, and so we ended up with a situation where I would program the Synclavier, Ian would play synths, and we had these enormous racks. At that time, my rig was 2 tons. It was the Synclavier and racks and racks and racks of synths and free synths. I guarantee you that between Ian and I, we had bought and got rid of every synthesizer ever made at that point. And we were stuffed into this place called Castle Oaks out in Calabasas.
Yeah.
With a Neve that was crackling and wasn't particularly working well. So I was then phoning friends because we had no money. So I had to beg manufacturers to borrow money to record the score. So I managed to persuade Mackie to lend me 5 of the HR824s that I could use as a surround monitoring system, and a 32 by 8, which was the thing we would put all the we would go through the Neve to my rack of 6 Tascam DA88s.
Yeah.
Which and then we put them onto the DA8, and then they would come back through the Mackie to be monitored.
Which was a surprisingly good sounding board. I had one too.
Yeah. And so, but we were stuffed into this room, and basically there would be 3 keyboards. There would be Ian, then James in the middle, then me on the right. And between James and me, or James and Ian, depending on what's going on, Jim Cameron would walk in to listen to cues. And so he'd come and sit down, and we'd work on this. And we would be playing stuff down to him, and he'd say, yeah, it's great, but I've cut the scene. And we go, oh, okay. I mean, this is what happens. But we go, but it's incredible. How much did that cost? Yeah, it's $1 million, but it just doesn't work. And that in terms of the Jim Cameron, his ruthlessness with his own material is something that I have also learned, which is that you don't, he's amazing at being an editor of his own stuff.
Right.
Because when we started with Titanic, it was the first edit we worked with was close to 5 hours long. And gradually, it got shorter and shorter and shorter. And at some point in this process, you can hear the reason, you can hear how little money we have. And it's interesting. I went back to the score because we did a live show with James Horner. We did a live version of Titanic with orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. And so I and Jack Redford had to go back and look through the scores and try and work out what the hell had happened. And Joey Rand, the editor, and Jim Henriksen, the editor, we all went through, and they sent the master tapes over from Fox And we looked and we, these horrendous hacks like crazy, because everything is always being hacked, because that's what happens to film. But also with the fact that I had this recollection that we'd recorded more orchestra than we did. Now, there was some orchestral recording. James found some money at the very end to do some more orchestral recording. So there was orchestra. But things I thought were really largely orchestral turned out to be literally like 16 bars at the end. There is this famous cue called Take Her to See Mr. Murdoch, which is a beautiful cue. It's the one when the Titanic is leaving the dock. It's one of the moments I will always remember, in terms of being in a score, being there when something is being created. That was incredible. And gradually we had to build this tempo map that gradually sped up as you saw the enormous engines going, everything else. And I and Ian, I think we created this choir patch. And I remember making out the Synclavier and about 6 or 7 synths, which is, and you had the dun 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 dun. It's this synthetic choral sound. It's not meant to be a synthetic choral sound. It's meant to be the Harlem Boys Choir. But we had no money. So it stuck. And that cue, 2/3 of that cue is purely synthesizers. It's stuff that we recorded at Castle Oaks. Now, thank God we had Sean Murphy at the end to mix it and make it sound Sean Murphy-like and wonderful. But we added orchestra at the very end. You can hear it. There's this point where there's orchestra towards the end. Right at the end, there's a key change, and suddenly the orchestra happens for maybe 30 seconds at the end. But the vast majority of it is synths. And if you listen to the score, the vast majority of Titanic is synths, because we had no money.
Amazing.
And then, of course, at some point, James gave me this piano sketch and said, there's this song.
Just a little ditty.
And I'd done loads of stuff with Celine at this point. I'd produced tracks for Celine. I'd done loads of other stuff for Celine. And obviously the stuff I'd done with David, I'd done all the, there was that point in the 90s where all of those, the Because You Love Me and all those things, I knew that. I did, done album after album with her. And we had, years earlier, there was meant to be a song called Dreams to Dream that was going to be on American Tale 2 that Celine was going to sing. And for a number of reasons, she did an incredible version of it, and it sounded amazing. But it turned out that it ended up going back to, I'm trying to remember her name. There was a point where there had been a Linda Ronstadt. There had been a duet, Peebo Bryce and Linda Ronstadt, out somewhere out there.
Right.
I think it was Peebo, or maybe James Ingram. I'm trying to think of the duet it was. And for American Tale 1, and that'd been a huge hit. And therefore Spielberg thought that, obviously the next film needed to have another standout song. And it was a beautiful song, Dreams to Dream, that James had written with Will Jennings, I think, again. And Celine did a version of this. And at some point, though, that everybody decided that they needed to have Linda Ronstadt back on just for that resonance. So Celine got dumped off the song and Linda Ronstadt's version happened. It sounds wonderful. I mean, Linda Ronstadt's version sounds great too. It's just very different to Celine. Different key. I had to reprogram the whole thing down. We got the extra players with different, it was all very, very different. But James always remembered that version and said to me, came to me, and I've still got the piano sketch he gave me. It's not his original, obviously, but it's the original he gave me of My Heart Will Go On. And there are people, by the way, who claim that they came up with the key change and all this.
It's in
bollocks. It's in. The only person who came up with the key change was James. There are people that claim a lot of things about that song, and they're all wrong, and they're all telling porcupines. That song was in really great state when I got the piano thing. Now I can take credit for the way that it sounds, I think, but as a song, I think that no, that was there. It was James. It was Will.
Right.
So he gave me a piano sketch and said, "Could you make this sound right for Celine? I want to give it her as a demo to let her see whether she wants to sing it." And so I demoed it up, and I had a particular Fender, it's not Fender Rhodes, it's a particular Rhodes sound that I had created. You will hear it on a number of records. This one particular, it isn't, I can guarantee that almost no one else has this particular sound. It was a very unusual thing I used to make it, but I made this, so you hear the I put in the Rhodes, I put in the programmed up the whole demo, and everyone's going, "This is great. It's really, really good." And at this point, James says, "I want to take it to Celine and get her to sing the track." Now, Jim Cameron doesn't know about this at all. Didn't want a song at the end of his film. And we're not sure which key Celine is going to sing it in. So what I do is I lay it down onto the DA88s, 3 different keys: D flat, D, and E flat, just so that she can get that, see where the top note really hits right.
Yeah.
Now we've written everything else. Well, not we, sorry. James has written everything else in the film. At the end of the film is in D. But just in case, we do a D flat. I stay in LA because I have to finish off laying down some other cues for the film. And he flies overnight to New York. He gets a red eye, goes to Hit Factory, where Hum was working with Celine on something else, and Celine sings a vocal. They throw the tapes in. She sings her vocal. And I know that I have said sometimes that this is a one take. There is an 8-track, which I did compile. This is between you and me and everybody else here, but
yeah, don't worry, nobody's listening.
Anyway, but it's that there are certain one take vocals, like the "I Will Always Love You" vocal that Whitney did is a one take vocal, except for the last note. That is one take, pretty well. And they then tweaked one note at the very end. But the Titanic vocal is a comp that I made. But it was, we're comping between Perfect and other versions of Perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like we're sitting there trying to hunting for something.
Yeah.
And at this point we decided that James flies back that night because he has to finish we still got to get on. We've got another film. We've got the film to finish. He flies back and hands me the tapes. I go and listen. I'm going, "This sounds amazing. This is great. This is wonderful." And you chose D flat. When I did, and I go, I know I've told this story before. I'm sorry, but
that's brilliant.
He was so tired. He had perfect pitch. He was so tired he hadn't noticed that it was in D flat. That instead he thought he'd given them the D as the first version. No. So My Heart Will Go On was in D flat, which meant, unfortunately, we had this horrendous clash, which was the last cue on the film, then just. So what has to happen is that we have to go back and re-record the last chunk of the film with a little modulation earlier to try and make it so that it fits into this. So we've now got a vocal and we've got a track in D flat. And James has a cassette that I have made of the demo. I've mixed it roughly, and he walks around with the cassette for weeks on end, waiting for the right moment to play Jim the demo. There's a point where Jim says to James, it feels like there should be a song at the end of this film. Well, actually,
Here's one I prepared earlier.
yeah. At which point, Jim loves it. Absolutely, obviously says, this is incredible. This is wonderful. I love this. So everyone says to me, well, you've got to finish it off. You've got to mix it for the film and everything else. And I say, yeah, it's great. I want to put in, I've got to do all the things. I want to add some lines. I want to get Dean and Michael Thompson to come and do some guitars. I want to do this, that, and the other. We do all the things you do to make a record zingy the way that one does.
Yeah.
And the word comes down, you're not allowed to change a fucking note. And I went, what? It said, the fear was that Jim would change his mind.
Right.
He loved the demo. He just loved it as it was. And so I wasn't allowed to add anything. I wasn't allowed to tweak anything. So what I did was, obviously, I went to Record Plant and I mixed it, because they didn't want anybody else to mix it but me, because they wanted it to sound like what Jim liked. So I mixed it in 5.1 at Record Plant. But it is effectively the Synclavier. We did add real orchestra. I orchestrated a few notes at the very end. There was a point at the key change. There is the ridiculous key change at the end, which is not by anybody else but James Horner. And at that point, you have real orchestra. But everything beforehand is the Synclavier and synthesizers, because I wasn't allowed to add anything else. I wasn't allowed to do anything.
You weren't allowed to spend it. And before, you couldn't do it because there was no money. So
yeah,
it's the story.
Exactly. So the answer is that and the ship sank. and obviously Jim Cameron was totally right.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. The changing it was, adding the guitars would not have helped.
Yeah.
So that was my first, Horner
amazing
meeting.
So just because obviously you did a lot more work with James, and then even took over Magnificent Seven, right, to finish that up after he died. We can spend as much time as you want talking about that, but I'd also love to get to a couple other things. So maybe we could segue a little bit and talk about the theme park stuff you've done based on some of the music you did with James, and then how how do you even transition into that? Because obviously that is a completely different kind of mixing, but it means it has to be a different kind of writing as well, I would imagine.
It is. I mean, I'm allowed to talk about this because Disney actually announced that I was working on it. So that this is one of those things where, but I can say everybody thinks that films are like the top notch, the top level in terms of the sort of things that we do. But I think people miss the fact that there is another level up. There are some other things that happen once you get to films, and for all of the things you think, why would anybody believe this? Theme parks, especially Disney, working with Imagineering, is one of those things of the next level up, because I've got 5 hours of music playing in Pandora World of Avatar, which is the theme park based around Avatar. That will play for 20 years. And 30,000 people a day go in there and they hear this music. And most people will only ever go to that theme park once in their life. So it has to feel fresh, and it has to feel exciting, and there has to be a level of quality that is expected of everything. And it's not just the stuff in Avatar. I think, obviously I had 2 masters that were there, 3 masters. I had James looking over my shoulder from above. I had Jim Cameron looking over my shoulder from there, and I had Disney looking over my shoulder from here as well. So the sense is that they understand that they take the time to make it great, because once it's locked in place, there aren't any changes. So people think, people sort of may think, oh, theme park. The reality is that the care and attention that goes into this music, as you know, I'm sure you've done stuff like this, the care and attention that goes into these things is second to none. I got to record at Abbey Road with the London Symphony Orchestra to do the flying ride and the and the various other bits and pieces in the score. It's not like anybody is shirking their responsibility to make it great. And then we're getting to mix this in Awesomeness, which is this 3D immersive system, because the idea is that the music has to be part and parcel of that whole connected thing of the visuals, the sound effects, and the dialogue, and any dialogue, and the music. And the music is an emotional part of that. And for both of the rides, attractions, for both of the attractions, and for the various different bits of music that go throughout the park, everybody is taking an enormous amount of care of saying, right, we're going to make this as great as it can be. And I remember initially talking to the people there saying, this seems like there's a lead time is quite long, but then you realize that part of that is because they want to try and make sure that it is great, and they also want to make sure that it is right, and that allows for mistakes, which I love. I mean, I reserve the right to be wrong at all times. And I think that's part of the creative process, is that you need to be able to have those mistakes in order to find the way. The problem is that with the compressed delivery times that we have, most of those times, that time to make those errors that are part of the creative process doesn't happen. But Imagineering thrive on those errors because they look at that. That's how they find the way forward. And in the park, it was one of those things where the music has to be of Pandora. It has to feel like it is of the place. And obviously, because I'd done the film and because I'd worked on a lot of other stuff, there was an understanding of everything that went there. But the after James's death in 2015, I think it was, there was a point where they said to me, they came to me and said, well, we'd like you to take over handling this. And it was there was several years to go. And so you have to I wanted to make sure that I took care of this little delicate thing that James Horner had created, this musical idiom that is the Avatar, the sound of Avatar
Right.
as a score. And it has a particular sound, I think, that doesn't sound like anything else. And then also the fact that there was the sense of this land. And when you have millions of people going there every year, all discovering the place for the first time, it's something that I love. There was a cue in the film where I got my son, who was 7 or 8 years old, to sing on the cue. And I had some other stuff that I'd recorded with him, and there's a point where we put some of that into one of the rides, and my son is now 19, and he'll be able to take his children there, and when he's in his 30s, and probably still hear that piece of music. That there's a longevity to parks that I think people don't understand.
Yeah. Now, just a tiny technical part of it. So the playback systems, obviously, for the rides, there's a progression through the music, there's a progression through the sound. Are you working, is this mixing environment an object-based thing that then gets translated onto the speakers, or do you actually set up the speaker setups?
There is, I mean, I've done a lot of 3D immersive stuff. And one of the things, obviously, Atmos is the de facto that everybody uses because it allows that translation to everybody else. But in terms of installations, there is Awesomeness, which is was invented by the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, the people who created the MP3 and then got set off, has a has an incredible ability to literally put a sound in your face. If you set up an array of speakers, you can be in that 3D space. And hearing that and hearing some of the future stuff that I've heard recently, it really is incredible. That object where you hear a sound, I was able to do a thing where there's in the ride, there are things where there are things I could paint positions of things going past. Now we have to adapt for the fact that we're in a large auditorium, and the place is, because it's big, you don't get that perfection that you get in an enclosed Atmos or Iosono mix space. But it is incredible. I've done one in China with 240 loudspeakers in a Taurus. But with the ones we did down in Florida, because there's two things happening. First of all, that this isn't a static environment. There's things are moving like this all the time. So you have to work against the fact that the mix has to respond to the environment that it's in. And then you're trying to place stuff in 3D. So there is that sense of beds and objects. But it's expanded. I think this was, Atmos was sort of coming into the world of that then, when we started. It's only more recently that it's taken over sort of everything. But at that point, it wasn't quite object-based enough for what we need in terms of being able to just place a sound there.
Right. And do you get to go check things on the actual installation, or do they just trust the objects and that's that?
No. We start with a rough, like a mix setup where we work on initially. So, I would start where we're doing rough mixes so that the creative people can listen, have a discussion, everything goes. And then obviously you have to do the final mix in the environment.
Right.
Because there's no other way of doing it. And again, the greatness of, working with people like Imagineering is that they want you to be there, and they respect the fact that the music has to be as good as it can be.
Right.
And that doesn't mean, oh, you're the composer, or you're, thank you, go away now, which is what you typically get on a lot of things. No, this is one of those things where there is a sense of making sure that everything is as good as it can be.
Right. Well, so let's segue from that into something I definitely want to hear about, which is a similar sort of project in terms of the audio setup, but completely different musically, which was your mixes for the Pink Floyd exhibition at the V&A, Their Mortal Remains, where we've got playlists like we do every week, and one of your work playlist songs is Comfortably Numb, which obviously we've got the album version, but you did a 30 speaker immersive mix of that song, among others, for the installation there. So I would love to hear about some of that.
Because I do a lot of 3D, came a point where I've always done a lot of 3D. I do large space 3D as well as just like immersive. And I got a phone call saying, Pink Floyd would like to talk to you about the fact that they want to do an immersive 3D thing. And this came through Sennheiser, who I know, and I'm a great fan of their everything. But it's particularly their main monitors are just great. The KH420s and 870s are just great. And I'd done some 3D mixes with myself and Simon Rhodes, who I work with on films, and who's the wonderful engineer at Abbey Road. And again, we've done so many things together. But we were working hand in glove, and they said, "Would you go and have a meeting?" So I had a meeting with the Floyd management, and I think with Nick Mason at this point, talking about how we wanted to do it. Now they wanted to make sure that their engineer was involved in the process, because it was important that they still. We're talking about the crown jewels here.
Yeah,
It's not like anything else. And so what we ended up doing is building in Studio 2 at Abbey Road, which was funny because it was the studio that a lot of this stuff had been recorded in the first place.
Yeah, the 70s, certainly.
Yeah. And in fact, there's a famous sound of someone banging from the floor above going, you can hear this thumping on the floor. And if you walk up the stairs, we found the panel. If you walk up those Studio 2 stairs up to the top of the staircase there, and you bang on the side, you can hear it is that sound. But anyway, so we set up this immersive center, this speaker system. And this wasn't meant to be like a typical, like a system, like a perfect studio. The idea was it needed to be like live. This was a live Comfortably Numb. So we wanted that live experience, but we wanted studio perfection.
Right.
And what we ended up doing is we built this array with 3 rings, and we could pan anything using the Sennheiser Ambio system, which is another way of using 3D. And then we were given the crown jewels, which is the multi-tracks, which have been transferred to 96K. And we're able to then take that on several other tracks. We were able to then find a way of building them into something, because there were going to be several hundred people in a room, and we wanted them to have that experience of being able to walk within the music. We've always talked about everybody wants to be inside the music. Now, what we know, like, for instance, when you say everyone wants to be inside an orchestra, no, you just hear the second clarinet and the French horn behind and everything else. So what happened was that we found a way, which I'm really pleased with, where you could always hear the mix wherever you were. But you could walk towards Roger Waters, because we had live video that went with this live show. This was that Live 8 show where they were finally together, the original band. And we found a way so that you could walk towards Roger Waters and you would hear Roger, but you never got the sense of the mix disappearing. It was just that Roger became more in focus. Or you could walk over to Rick, or you could walk over to David Gilmour, or anything else. You could move in and you could focus on different things. And obviously we could spin things around. We could do, in this case, hello, hello, hello.
Yeah.
Voice of God, which is 6 yards up, 6 meters up overhead. We hung 2 of these big studio monitors overhead. And so, is anybody up there? Was above you. And then gradually, then everything else was around. And if there is one band in all of Christendom that requires you to hear things in 3D, it is Pink Floyd. You know, they were the first band. Dark Side of the Moon was cut in quadraphonic before it was a stereo. We mixed a whole load of stuff that if you see the reviews, people saying that this is the most incredible thing they've ever heard. There was a point where they brought in some of the hi-fi freaks, the different, all the people just to listen to this experience. And it isn't like an Atmos mix. It's not a sense of what I made a choice about this, which is that we didn't want to be a proscenium arch where everything is over there. If you think about this, the music has always been over there. The band is over there. Even the orchestra is over there. The opera is over there. The screen is over there. Music has always been, even when we did 5.1 and 7.1 and Atmos, everything is over there. And with that immersive music, the idea is that music is everywhere. But we had to do this with Pink Floyd in a way that the mix wouldn't degrade. And I was really, really pleased with what we created. And I think the reviews stood for the fact that people said it was, they were blown away by what they heard. I can tell you that if there are opportunities to hear some of the other stuff that we mixed, I will embrace those with both hands, because there's some incredible stuff.
I would love to hear all this stuff. It's just amazing, because as you say, there are bands sort of made for it. Even with how minimal a lot of the productions are, they're absolutely made to be in an environment.
There's a difference between listening to this like in a home cinema place. with like when you listen to some of these beautiful mixes that people are doing in Atmos and everything else. But again, it's over there. You're listening to this. This was in a space that was the size of Abbey Road Studio 2. So it was a big enough space that you had that sense of, we had several kilowatts of PA, probably, if you're thinking about it, probably 15 kilowatts of incredibly high quality monitoring going, and not at Motorhead levels, but loud enough that you enjoyed, that you got that sense of the being there. And it was, I'm insanely proud of the work.
That's great. I love that Motorhead is your gauge of like, well, that's loud. Motorhead's loud.
No, actually, no. We both know what the loudest thing we've ever heard was. And the loudest thing, undoubtedly, I think, was Michael's personal PA system in his studio at Hit Factory.
Yes, only rivaled by the guy in the rocket suit at the end of the shows of the Dangerous tour. Yes, that was absolutely insane. Yeah, I mean, it was like the largest pair of headphones you've ever worn. Yeah. So I got one more thing that I want to talk about, and then we'll get some questions from the piece. But so moving forward to that, this has all been really, other than the jingles, about you working on other people's music. But I want to hear about this piece, The Birth of Skies and Earth, which was premiered last year in China and then toured China. 90-piece orchestra, 80-piece choir, and then they said 176. So I'm imagining 6 soloists.
6 soloists, yeah.
So I would love to hear about the piece itself, but also why it was in China, how it was done in China, like what, and also the fact that it's in Mandarin. So do you speak Mandarin? Was there
perfectly?
Yes.
No.
I'd love to hear just about the genesis of the piece itself, but also just sort of you as a composer, because obviously working with other film composers is always a compositional element in it, but you're working for them. So to go on your own to be the artist in a way, and just how did it come about and how was it?
Well, I'd made a decision. I mean, before James's Horner's death, I mean, I had this habit of wanting to work on the best things possible. And so I often would do things where I would turn down gigs as a composer because I would rather have been I wanted to be on the biggest game in town. And so for many years I had done things where people, like when I was programming, when I was doing arrangements and producing records, people would just, I preferred to be doing the Celines and the Quincy's and the whatever else of these things, rather than just producing less stuff, because it was more fun. It was just more challenging. And I always wanted to challenge. But so I'd been composing for a while. There was a point, I think, where I decided it was time just to stop everything and just transition to be a permanent composer. And I had done a piece of immersive work for the Shanghai Tower. The Shanghai Tower is this incredibly beautiful skyscraper that looks like a piece of bamboo twisted. It's 2,000 feet high. And they have an art space at the top of the Shanghai Tower, the 126th floor. And they had put this beautiful sculpture in there. And then for some reason, they had also put in this 244 loudspeaker Taurus as a Iosono 3D immersive thing. And a friend of mine who I'd worked with on, we both had a passion for immersive music, and he was the guy who had put in that system, said, we're having problems we're finding a composer for this. Would you like to come to Shanghai and talk to the owners of the Shanghai Tower? And they interviewed a number of composers, and I went there and I talked to them about the way that the music should flow within the system, and the way that, because the emotional connection it should have, and they hired me. So at this point, I then wrote this immersive piece. It's about 15 minutes long, and it's proper immersive film music, in the sense that you can walk around within it. Things are spinning around, and there are traditional Chinese instruments. There's a choir where I put an individual mic on every single singer and then placed them in 48 different loudspeakers around the space. We had 4 interlocking orchestras. I recorded all this at Air with Simon. But I wrote the orchestra parts as 4, a face north, south, east, west, basically. So that, because you think about it, what we talked about earlier, which is that being in the middle of orchestra is just usually the second clarinet and the French horn behind and whatever else. Wherever you are, you hear it. The problem is that you want to be inside, and the only way to do that properly is to write it as a 3D space. So what I did was write the music so that there's a point where I wanted a big peal of brass, like a Carillion of brass. So I went da 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 da. Now I wanted this, so what I did was write orchestra 1 to play da 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 da. Second orchestra 2, ba da da. Orchestra 3, ba da da. Orchestra 4, ba da da. So you get this ba da 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 da, and then things going over the top, and that involved thinking about the scores as they interlocked to make this 3D, and then we could move the woodwinds around and so on. So I'd had fun with this. This was all enormously joyful. And some point, probably a year later, I get a phone call saying, "Hey, we've got this thing that, the Shanghai Media Group." Now, the way that which is the organization within Shanghai that provides grants for great cultural works and so on. Shanghai Media Group would like to talk to you about the thing, which is that they have this idea of creating an oratorio, a big orchestral piece based on the myths and legends of China, of the creation myths of China.
Right.
And they are literally from the darkness of the beginning of the universe to the creation of China as a country, and all these steps in between. And so nothing, a small subject. And so I went, and they had got these some of Shanghai's great poets to write some beautiful lyrics in Mandarin for the various different sections. There were 20 different sections which are combined to make this thing, which literally started from the, like the sort of Chronos type idea of the darkness, the beginning of the universe, and then there's this enormous thing who tears the universe and creates the stars, and then creates the heaven and earth. And then there is the sense of there are all these myths and legends that go through, and they involve dragons and phoenixes, creation of writing, the creation of music, the creation of China as a country, the battles, emperors, all this stuff going through, and these lyrics, and in Mandarin. And so I said, well, okay. So they said to me, would you like to, could you talk to us about this? And we'd like to make this into an orchestral, like an oratorio, but it's almost, what they called it was orchestral epic. I think the music, that was the idea. And so it sounded, I mean, again, the curiosity gene. I mean, I have my 3 rules. I know I've told you my 3 roles before, which is I learn from it, I earn from it, or it's fun. And I will only ever do a job if it hits one of those 3. So this was like, this was like great. Trifecta. They were paying me well. I was going to learn a huge amount. And they wanted something that varied from pure classical Chinese, sort of like with Chinese singers, to more pop stuff and various. So it was a variation of stuff, but they wanted something that was accessible to young kids as well as to older people. They didn't want it to be purist opera, although I'm about to do an opera, but this wasn't that. And so I started writing, and there came a point where I worked out how to write in Mandarin, which was once I broke the back of that, which is that I found a way that I could actually write my themes against the language they'd given me. And then once I'd done that, once I'd broken the back of that, then it was just a composing gig. Then it was a case about writing, except that I also needed to make sure that I incorporated some of the sense of you know, there are sort of musical idioms that every culture has, you know. So the Chinese, especially the Central Chinese, have a sort of more, the hand type have a slightly more, you know, there's a sense of the pentatonic things. There's certain instruments that they like. Whereas I've worked with Mongolians who are the most incredible singers, the most incredible players, but they have a completely different feel.
Very,
And
yeah.
and I love working with Mongolians. They are the most fun. But this was a more traditional Chinese thing. And I wrote this piece, and it was meant to be more Western. The reason they came to me rather than to a Chinese composer, of which there's some amazing ones, was they wanted something that had that sense of an international flavor. And then it started to get, what was started with a sort of slightly smaller orchestra gradually got bigger, because when I took it to Shanghai to start rehearsals, the conductor, who was this fabulous conductor who is the chairman of the Shanghai Opera, just so saying, "Oh, you know what? You need a few more players. You need a few more singers." And gradually, what was a 60-piece orchestra with 40 singers became a 90-piece orchestra with 85 singers, and then this thing, and it expanded. And they did this beautiful thing where they were doing projections. They were mixing it in immersive, and then it was a fabulous experience. So that's why I wrote it in Mandarin, because it was for a Chinese audience. It may get translated into other languages at some point, but it was one of the things that film composers, we never own our music. I don't mean we don't, you know, technically by the language, but the music is the director's. We're there to service the director. We're there to give the director what they need for their film. And the moment we think our music is more important than the film, we've lost the point.
Yeah.
But when I'm doing pure composition, I've got a couple of other pure compositions. This is the time I can just write what the hell I want. And this ended up being 94 minutes, you know, the first half of about 55 minutes. And then I thought something like that, 50 minutes. And then I made 40 minutes, 45 minutes in the second half with a break to allow us to stretch our legs and buy ice cream. And but it was what I wanted to write, you know. And I think that's the difference between a pure composition gig, when you actually get to do bring your own stuff to it. And the great thing about especially working with the Shanghai Media Group and with the SLMO and all the people who I worked with there, who were wonderful, was that they say, well, you are the composer. Yeah. And then they would just allow me to compose, which, for everything else we do, we're so used to people second guessing everything that we do. You know, that every mix that you do, the point when you actually have one client is when your mixes usually end up best. I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, who knows? It's we don't want to go into my anyway, but yes, I definitely take your point. And I think it's amazing to, I mean, obviously you have the history of working on amazing music, but to not necessarily have the history as a composer, but to be given that platform and those resources must have just been amazing, absolutely amazing. And then to show up with what you think is a finished piece and to be given even more resources because people are starting to see the vision of what you were doing, and that, well, that's going to work better with 6 horns than 4 horns, so get them in here. And it's a really just a fantastic opportunity. Now, is there a recording of this piece anywhere?
No, and I wish there was. We did it live, and I think somebody may have filmed it at some point, but no, there isn't. I wish there was a proper recording of it, because it was a good noise.
Right.
I was very proud of it.
That's amazing. And that's a phrase that you used to use a lot more, and I love that, where you say it's a good noise. That is one of my favorite of your expressions. We could go, I mean, we haven't even talked about Eric Clapton, but let's
that was a session gig. That was literally just me playing keyboards. That was one thing. Yes, never forget about it.
Clapton, whatever. So we should bring Mark back in, though, and get some questions, because we're already 2 hours. I told you, this thing is just, they fly by. They fly by, and this has been amazing. But if Mark hasn't gone out for a burger, he's not allowed to go out. There he is.
Hey, this has been great, guys. Thank you. Yeah,
You're very welcome.
so much fun listening. Okay, so people have the ability to submit questions and then vote them up in the area below. So guys, go into that section right below the video, the Ask a Question section, and upvote some of your favorite questions.
Yeah,
and we'll start out. Yeah, and we'll start with the top voted question for you, and that is: when scoring a film, are you given a lot of guidelines or suggestions as to what is wanted, or are you usually allowed full creative freedom?
You're almost never given full creative freedom these days. When I started, when I was working with people like, when I was working for other composers, the people like John Barry, he got creative freedom because they said do what you want. But everybody else I've ever worked with has a situation where as the temp score, which is this thing where somebody puts in bits of music from every other film that they, as Jim Cameron says to me, he's like, I can temp from he said to me once, I could temp from every movie ever made and make a perfect temp. And that is and that's the issue. And you can hear that in everybody's scores, whether it's Hans's or James Newton Howard or anybody else. You can often hear the fact that you can sort of feel the flavors that have been coming, because there is this point, you go, oh, wait a second. There are times when I go, oh, Pirates of the Caribbean, oh, Inception, oh, what was the one, the flavor a couple of years ago, Sicario. You go, okay, there are all these things where the flavors come in and then the temp scores appear with the flavors in them. The problem with that, which is, it's great for the director at the point that they're in the process, which is that they are trying to get a sense of where the film is, because the film is not finished, but they're trying to put their best foot forward with their producers, with everybody else. So they're temping it to try and make it as good as it can be. The problem is they start fall in love with the temp, or not in that, they get more accustomed with the temp.
And they edit to the temp, and yeah, it's a part of the movie.
And so now you have a situation where the poor composer has this musical soundtrack, and the director is saying, please copy this. Now, sometimes it is, you have to interpret this and you say, right, what you're saying to me is you want the emotion that goes from this. I'm going to give you that same emotional feeling, but I'm going to write it my own way. And if you're lucky, that's what will happen. And that should be how a temp goes in. There are the bad points where, and I have seen this both as a composer, but also as being on, in with every other composer I ever worked with. Because one of the things about my previous life before I started writing music is that I very rarely did sessions. I would work on projects for weeks or months on end. It was usual for me to work for long periods of time with people. So I would see this whole process going on. And the temp forces the composer into a box that maybe they don't want to be in. But the problem is also that it forces the music into the place where it starts repeating it's echoing other people's music. And so you end up with stuff where for a quiet life, you copy this previous temp cue. And that, unfortunately, is where a lot of the music we hear these days has this feeling of being copied, because time has become shrunk in the composing process. That idea of James Horner or James or Alan Silvestri or John Barry going away for a few weeks or a few months to write the film and the theme and then come back and then present it. Because it used to be, when I first started, the first time the director would hear the music properly was when the conductor went 1, 2, 3, 4 and the orchestra played it. Now we do these ridiculous demos. I have an insane setup here with, I'm if we just, my Mac Pro will now probably, apart from the fact that it can't fly, it can pretty well do everything else going. It's I've just replaced multiple computers with 28 core 384 gigabytes of RAM and 24 terabytes of our NVMe RAID in the thing. And the reason I do that is because it allows me to make demos that are great, because the directors want to be able to hear that. The problem is that we're sort of like, that sense of allowing a composer to write his or her own music is rare these days.
Well, and just a tiny thing. It's not new either. I mean, it's obviously more complicated than this, but the score for 2001 is the temp score. It happens to be liggity, and but it was the temp score. I bought my dad the soundtrack album of the score that was written for 2001, and it's nothing like in there. It's not Strauss.
I know, and one of my best friends is Jim Henriksen, who is one of Jim is Yoda, our nickname, and genuinely he's one of the wisest men in all of film music. And he worked on Spartacus. And he created probably the first temp, because there was a point where he was asked by Kubrick to put some music to one of the scenes, and he started temping it from classical music. And so I blame Jim Henriksen for all his fault.
So, Mark, are you as frozen as it seems you are?
It's what I hear from some other people. Let me refresh my video here.
We can hear your mouth.
Yeah.
So that's fine. So what's
That's
our next?
good. How about now? Is that better?
No, but we can hear you perfectly.
It's a really
I hope it throws on like an embarrassing face, because that'd be great. Cool. Okay. Here is the next most upvoted question. This is from Joaquin Bishkoff, and it is: as a Synclavier owner, would you recommend Synclavier 5 by Arturia? Did you try it? He says, I owned a Synclavier, but I got it in extreme bad condition, and it died after we had a flooding in the studio. That's tragic.
Yeah, it's great. It's really, really good, and it's a lot cheaper. No, it is really good. I think it's genuinely, they've tried to do the best, and it does a lot of things that the original doesn't do at all. It has many more partials. I can create some much more fun stuff in there, in theory, than it has the original code. Along with the other thing is the iPad app that Cameron has written, which is insane as well.
Well, and they also have the knob as a hardware controller that you can get. And that knob is spring-loaded with velocity, sensitivity, genius.
$300 for the knob, but it's great. Yeah. But and I missed, by the way, I've asked so many manufacturers, could you just build me like a controller like that, because it's the perfect controller. Synclavier is it's I have the Synclavier V in the Arturia. It's really, really good. And the sampler, being able to put some of the samples in the sampler thing is good. It doesn't sound the way that the real machine does. There is something about the way that when you pitch things down 2 octaves in the Synclavier, the aliasing just doesn't happen.
No, I mean, the thing about the converters on the Synclaviers, they were completely variable from 0K up to 100K. So you had 100K sampling, and there was this thing where when you would go over 50K, that relays would flip in the box, and you'd start using circuitry differently, like in a Fairchild. Lots of stuff running at half speed. So there are tons and tons of libraries on the Synclavier that were done at 50.5K. So you'd get just over that. You'd hear the relays click, and then you were using all the gear. And you can't recreate all of it. But in terms of the synthesizer, I mean, it was a digital FM synth. So obviously you can recreate that.
Yeah. And of all the, it's a really cool digital FM synth, and you can sound like Beat It. That's great. And I've made some wonderful noises. I think there's some stuff in Titanic when we're down at the bottom of the ocean. I seem to remember using the FM, because it had this low end. It was an unusual low end, the bottom end on the Synclavier FM. But the sampler, nobody's ever quite managed to mimic that. I don't think the Arturia does a very good job, but the problem is that you're dealing with, a voice card that was this big, and every voice went to, to an output, and it was
a multi-channel bin that was in real time.
It's a great noise. And yes, so to answer your question, go ahead, use it, you'll love it.
Very good. Awesome. Okay, so Sebastian GF next asked the next question here, and that is, hi guys, thanks a lot for taking the time to share with us. As a composer for performing arts music, the way of mixing is not the same as a song. Is it a twist between sound design, Foley's, and a concert? So how is the process of mixing music for a movie compare to a song? So a
I get
score
it.
versus something.
So this is how John Barry put it to me. Here's the dialogue. Here are the sound effects. I'll keep going down.
Yeah, your hands
the
way off
music.
Move the camera.
Yeah, and you have to remember one really important thing is that the people are going to the cinema need to hear the words. They're not there to hear your music. You know, much as you want them to sit there and hear every triplet that you've written, they're actually trying to work out whether the hero is in love or hates the heroine. They're trying to work out why the baddie is doing what they're doing, and so on, between the popcorn. And that's really important that they can hear that. The other thing is they need to have that sense. Sound effects place you in the space. I'll give you an example. On Avatar, you need to hear the flaps of the wings of the Ikrans, or because the flying banshees. Because if you don't hear them and feel the air moving under their wings, you won't believe them. And therefore, the sound effects have to have that sense of reality. Now, there will be those moments when you have your moment when you get to push your music forward, and you grab those and you go, right, I've got my moment, my Oscar-winning moment, my Grammy-winning moment, whatever. That point when you can do something that is special. But those are few and far between, because your job as a composer for picture is to sit there and support the emotion of the feeling that is underneath. And you're there. We don't walk around with an orchestra behind us as we're walking down the street.
Well, I do.
I've heard
there's a Woody Allen film.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I remember. Yes, absolutely.
Marching band. But anyway.
Yes. But the point is the music has to feel like it is within. It can't feel like it's overwhelming. And you know, if you take I remember writing some cues, you know, some where you really think, oh, I've written some great stuff, but unfortunately there are two things will happen. One is the edit will then cut it out. You always know that your favorite cue is going to get thrown away. That's just what happens. And you must never try and own your music in the sense of wanting it. You know, you don't own it, they do. The second thing is that you have to make sure you stay out of the way of the explosions, out of the horse's hooves, out of the Ikran's wing flaps, or whatever it is. You have to make sure that you are there to support what's going on. And that's true of play. I remember writing music for a play when I was much younger. And there was a point where I was young, I thought my music was important. And I remember turning it up and we were mixing it. It was pre-records that were being playback in a theater. And I turned it up too much. And one of the old actors came up to me and basically he was an old English guy, quite famous, who really knew his stuff, and said to me, "Remember who's queen," and and it was enough to basically to make me understand that I had to turn the thing down, because ultimately it wasn't about the music; it was about what was going on stage.
Yeah, I mean, it in a way, it's the purest sort of, I don't want to say art form like art form, but it's the purest form of music in that its only job is to support and convey emotion and to help humans feel the emotions. There is nothing about the specific instrumentation or anything that is supposed to be heard as a musical thing. It is always an emotional thing. And it's tough. I mean, I haven't done nearly as much scoring as you, but I know so many times working with Wendy and Lisa when they were starting to score, we would have things that musically we thought were amazing and they sounded great and whatever. But if people didn't respond to it, it doesn't matter. None of that matters. And you need to do that in records as well. Like if you get done listening to a record and someone says, man, that snare sounds great, you have failed miserably. That's the worst thing anybody could say at the end of a record. So
although when it comes to Wendy and Lisa, I went to see, I remember seeing them at the Kentish Town Forum or something like that. They were just, I loved Wendy and Lisa so much. I mean, they are just ludicrous musicians, but
yes,
you know, they're just a ridiculous records.
But when the director wants a single piano note because it's the saddest note he's ever heard, that's your score.
Yeah, because that's the gig. You're a composer for hire. I write music by the yard for film. You know, right? You need that long, right? And then you're there to and if there's one thing you discover is that you're always right later. Okay, but it doesn't matter at this point. Your job is to support, because the director has the toughest gig in town, and you're there not only that if you're providing music for them, but you're also one of those things where the director can usually write scripts, the director can usually film, the director can usually light a scene, the director can usually art direct, the director can usually do these things. Music is this black box often to many of them. They can't write scores, they can't understand. And often the other thing is that directors usually have a very superior sense of visual ability. Their visual ability is usually very heightened. And if one takes the idea that your senses are in some sort of balance, or something else often has to give. And what I've tended to find is that often there's a situation where directors' visual acuity may not be supported by their musical acuity being at the same level.
But they do know when emotionally it's not doing what they want. And
absolutely,
you have to trust that, as annoying and horrendous as it can be sometimes.
Because they're doing the hard stuff. I'm just writing music.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it is a movie. It's not a movie with a score and a sound effect track it's just the film.
Yeah. I've got music that I was, now that we're in this new world, I was about to go and conduct a series of concerts later this year with some new music, which I obviously won't be doing because there won't be an audience and so on. But that is pure music. People go there, they listen to the music, and they can enjoy it or not.
Yeah.
But they're there to listen to the music. They're not there to hear me.
Oh.
That was interesting. Cool.
So that's my robot effect that I did for you.
Thank you so much.
Be an appropriate time, but I was worried I wouldn't be able to get it in.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that was Mark leaving. So,
back.
So Mark, before you explode in a shower of pixels, should we let one more, two more? What do you want to do? Because we should probably wrap this up pretty soon.
Let's see. Let's do. Okay, I have an interesting one about the background with both of you here, and this one is from Jesse F. Miller. He says, your bio says you're a Synclavier programmer. Or, sorry, Synclavier?
Synclavier, yeah.
Okay, better way to say it. Okay, so your bio says you're a Synclavier programmer for the Cool Runnings film in 1993. Any chance that you crossed paths with Andrew back then? So how did you guys get to meet each other?
Well, we first met in London. I was working for Synclavier. I was repairing them, and I was based in London. And we met because that was when you were doing jingles with your brother Nick.
Yeah.
And we'd met a couple of times with me just fixing things. And I think actually you may have been at SARM once when I was fixing Trevor's Synclavier as well.
Maybe, yeah.
But the first major interaction that we had was Simon and Nick had written a cue. I don't know what it was for. It was a jingle. It was an ad for something.
Dog food.
For dog food. And the Synclavier had an engraving music printing program as well. So you could print the parts after you'd sequence them. It was the Sibelius of the time. And their music printing wasn't working, but they had, and so you're talking about an orchestral session for a film, it's cost $100,000, but you're there all day. If you lose 5 minutes, it sucks. But if you're doing a jingle date, you've got an hour. maybe an hour and a half, and then it's done and it's over and the players go. So I was printing parts at the office because our music printing was working, and then faxing them back in the old days when faxes were there on curly paper. And I asked them, well, what order do you need them printed? It's like, oh, give me the harp part first. I remember having to give the harpist their part first so they could figure out what they were doing. And they were literally coming off the fax machine and taping them to the music stands and recording the jingle. And so that would have been in 89, I think, 89 or early.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think so. I think this was when I was about to move to LA, and Nick was starting to take over more of the jingle work. And by the way, this is Nick Franglen, who has a wonderful life as Lemon Jelly, which is a band that many people may know, which is a ridiculously great band. Anyway, so that was where we first started, and then we had Synclavier, then it was Barbra, then it was Michael, and everything else, and so it sort of went from there.
Yeah, and we crossed paths not often enough, but
yes,
just enough.
Yes,
right. Amazing. Well, Simon, do you have any tips for any up and coming, composers that might be watching right now for, I guess, just how to break into what you're doing and start working with some movie producers?
Well, the answer, first of all, the answer is you have to say yes to everything at the beginning, and there will be dog food commercials. Remember that the commercials, by the way, are great. I mean, if you think about the fact that if you take Ridley Scott started in commercials, or somebody who I work with all the time, who is an amazing director, a French guy called Jean-Jacques Arnaud. He was another guy who did these thousands of commercials. A lot of these guys started their careers in there. So often you meet people who are interesting. But the other thing is that, so the answer, first of all, is to get into this world, you're going to have to do rubbish. You're going to have to hope that you go from one step to another. I did kids' TV shows at the beginning. Everybody's done that. There are all these different things that you do to get to move forward. And I would say the other thing, in terms of breaking through, the other thing is to develop your own style. I think if there's anything that is going to make you break through over somebody else, it is sounding like yourself. I sometimes give the odd lecture to a number of people, to conservatories and stuff like that. And I remember somebody who brought me, there was a situation, I was in a conservatory and they were playing me cues that people had written. And I went, and they played me 6 of their best students. And I went, okay, yes. And I said, and I went, I'm choosing this one. And they went, but these are so much better. I said, yeah, but they all sound like Hans. This, I have no idea what it sounds like. I said, but why would you hire somebody to sound like Hans when you can hire Hans or somebody, to who will do it better? I would say trying to copy anybody else is a fool's errand. So the thing that you really need to do before anything else in terms of getting a gig is develop your own sound so that you actually have your own voice. Secondly, get your kit together so that you can actually make sure that your demo reflects what your intention is, because you can't expect them to understand what you're thinking unless you give them something that actually tells the story well. So the kit is important, not because it's going to make you a better composer. It's not. The kit is important because it's going to allow you to get your vision across. And that is the most important thing. If they can't tell what you're thinking, then you're screwed.
I think this goes right back to one of the very first things you said about the advice that Steve Lipton gave you about choosing the thing to be good at. Because if you've got one of those business cards where you're in everything and someone's in the studio saying, hey, we need a composer. If your card says composer, producer, engineer, no one thinks of you. But if they know, oh, Simon's the composer, Simon's the guy who does the nasty things to orchestral scores, having a thing that is truly your thing. It's what makes people think of you when they need something as well.
And I spent too long probably being in one box. It took me a while. Jumping from a box to another box is a difficult thing, as I think we've all discovered.
Yeah, and early success is one of the things that can make that even harder, because you don't have the sort of back catalog of other stuff already in place to say like, well, but I did this as well. You've got that one thing. But there are lots of people I know who've done it. I mean, you're certainly a huge example of that. And if you're good, you can do it. It just means it's like making decisions. You decided you didn't want to be an employee anymore. You decided you didn't want to do the jingles, but knew you'd learn to work quickly and you learned to work for other people. Then you didn't want to be writing for other people anymore. You wanted to write for yourself. And it's a progression. I mean,
I totally agree. I mean, everybody's done their ghostwriting times. I only ever ghost wrote for people who were great. I made a decision, which is that when somebody asked me to write cues for them, it could only ever be for somebody who was great. And the other thing was that I only ever, but I also, when I was a pro, when I was doing keyboard playing, when I was programming, when I was doing all of the stuff that I did, the records, there also came a point where I made decisions. I remember with David Foster, there was a point where I just said to him, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. Now, the problem was he then said, well, what about if we co-produce together? And you go,
okay.
Yeah. And then it was, because I was already getting points on records. I was already at a point where if somebody wanted me to work on a record, I already got a point on a record anyway. So the point wasn't the point. It was whether, and there was a point then when we produced stuff together. And then there came a point where I just went, okay, I've had it's time for me to move on. And I just decided that I wanted to do something else. And part of my life has been that I go and do something else. And
it's a good corollary to the idea of never being the smartest person in the room. And it's more, it doesn't have to be that. It's not like you got to the point where you thought you were better than David Foster or whatever, but you felt as though you had gotten out of it what you were going to get out of it. So now it's time to challenge and move on and grow and do something different.
Well, that thing. I mean, I think, if you look at your career as well, there comes a point where we decide we're comfortable in our own skins. And one of the things is that I don't believe that I have anything to prove to anybody as a composer, except that I don't have 100 films in my career. I believe that I'm a fucking good composer. And I would, and by the way, everybody who is a composer needs to think that, whether they are or not. You have to go into this believing you think that you are a fucking good mixer, because you are, but you have to go into that with a sense, and it's not arrogance. It's in the sense of the thing. It is a sense that you can't suffer from imposter complex, because
I do all the time, but yes,
it's that what we do is tough enough anyway. If we don't think we're good enough to do the job, then we shouldn't be there anywhere, because there is somebody else who probably should be. I mean, yeah. I have this conversation. I'm sure we've already had that, where somebody says to me, my son, my daughter wants to be this. And I say to them, is it the only thing they think about? And if the answer is no, then they shouldn't be doing it, because for somebody else's, it is their only thing that they have, that they can do. I'm unemployable in any other regard. But in terms of what I do, part of the job, we both get hired because some of it, and that's true whether you're John Barry, whether you're Maurice Jarre, whether you are James Newton Howard or Hans or Alan or anybody. A lot of people hired them for safety, because they guarantee that they know that the score will turn up and it will sound great. there is an element of that goes with every job, which is that if you are mixing a record, they know that they will hand the stuff to you and it will come back and it will sound great. And that's the tough thing when you're starting, is that somebody is always second guessing you because they're worried. And you have to sort of present that sense of confidence in your own ability, because if you don't have that confidence in yourself, then it translates to your client. And that's the most important thing that you can really do, is you need to make sure that you translate it, that you absolutely give that sense of you know what you're doing, and that you understand where they want you to go.
And I think it's also very important to make a distinction between projecting that and saying it. When you say it, it's arrogance. When you live it and project it, it's confidence, and it will help. People will feed off of it. But as soon as you just tell somebody it, now they have to actually decide whether they believe you or not.
Yeah. It's not that you're never going to say it, because that's just stupid.
I mean, we just did, but that's all right. It's just the internet.
but it's us. It's the point is that what I was trying to say was that I have to think that even if I didn't believe that I was good, then I would project that. And it's not arrogance at all. It's a sense of, you have to give a sense of comfort to the person who's paying you money, the person who's giving you their time, because time is so important to everybody. If they're going to spend their time with you, you have to sort of show them that there's a journey that you go on with everybody, whether it's a director, whether it's a band, whether it's anything. Whenever you're working on something, there is this journey, and they've got to work out whether they like being with you in the studio, or whether they like being on a stage, or any of those things. And that comes from the sense that you know where you're going.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of talk about how 90% of the job is the relationships with the people, but the relationship is built on the trust that they give you because they believe you can do the job. It doesn't matter if you're their best friend. If they don't think you can do the job, they're not going to be comfortable. And then there goes the possibility of having that 95% relationship. It can't happen without trusting in the other person's abilities.
And you don't need to be their best friend, by the way.
Oh, God, no.
I mean, the combat that happens sometimes is very much, some people really enjoy that sense of combativeness. They enjoy that. But there's also things where you have to understand that sometimes the journey has a lot of twists and turns. I did a couple of things with Terrence Malick, who's a director who enjoys the investigation of the creative process. And that means that you may do a theme 30 times, variations of different motifs before he chooses one. And yes, he may choose the first one you gave him, but that doesn't matter. That's part of the process. And because he could well have chosen number 30.
Right.
It's just that he wanted to see what would happen and see how that process evolved. And I think there are other people who say, well, I don't have time, just give me something. There are a few directors I work with who say, I will trust you to write some music for me. I will make a decision based on certain things. What am I, how am I feeling about this? Once they have a theme that they like, or themes, that's usually the investigative process, which is they want to find out that you understand their character. Once you've gone past that, then they feel comfortable that you've listened to them, and then they let you go because they've got more important things to do. They've got to edit the film. They've got to finish the thing.
Right. Well, Simon, we could do this for another 14 hours, but there's beer calling. So this has been absolutely amazing, and you're really good at this, and you should do it a lot more often. Just tell people what's up, because
what's up. Okay.
Yeah. Actually. Yeah.
Simon, the chat room blew up there on everything about imposter syndrome and everything. I think you really hit a good point for everybody. Thank you on that.
Yeah,
you're very, very welcome. And it's been very enjoyable. Call anytime.
Yeah, well, and we will see each other very soon. And just for next week, Some guy named Al Schmidt.
Did
you get this approved? Who is this guy?
I don't know. We'll see. I'll study up on him on Monday morning.
Give him a big kiss for me.
I will.
You know, we did that strike. That was the strike. One of the Streisands. I mean, I did so many things with Al. He's just
the best.
Yes, he is. It's fine. Excellent.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, Simon, thank you for all your work and your time. Everybody will be back tomorrow with Between Two Beards again. Tomorrow, Vance and Reed's guest will be Jakir King, so that's going to be a fun one.
That's 3 beards.
Yeah, 3 beards tomorrow. All right, thanks everybody. Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Andrew.
See you guys.
Thanks, man.